really solves the problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, we can and have had debates about this. Like my argument about the OpenAI New York Times case from a philosophical perspective is the AI explosion is good for the New York Times because having trusted branded content that is a totem, we discussed this in the context of trickery or sharp tech content, is actually beneficial if you have, I think there's
If you're
going to be
differentiated,
more of a market for that. Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
and do we want to handicap our AI industry to protect undifferentiated content? At the end of the day, that's sort of the argument that is implied here.
Mm-hmm.
But I do want to get to that OpenAI New York Times bit. The way to force the ChatGPT, and this was ChatGPT 3, I think, back in the day, to copy the New York Times, was you had to paste like the first 2 paragraphs of a New York Times article, and then it would spit out the rest because it got locked into like the predictive set of tokens, which it was trained on. And whose fault is that? Is that like, I could take a New York Times article, I could put it on a photocopier, and I could press a button and get 1,000 copies of that and walk around and hand it out. Is that the photocopier's fault?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, there's been a Supreme Court case about this, which is the Sony versus Universal case, the Betamax case, where Universal Studios sued Sony because you could record a TV show and then watch it later. And the Supreme Court ruled, number one, that was fair use to time shift on your own. And number two, because it was fair use, the Betamax had lots of legal uses, not just illegal ones. And so it wasn't their fault, right? And I think this distinction between the tool maker and the user making a decision is a really important one in general. This is, the counter was the Napster case, where basically the decision was, look, this is used for nothing but illegality. But that is also the problem with the Napster case in some respects, and some like the BitTorrent cases and things along those lines. But I do think that distinction, by and large, is an important one, and I think it falls heavily in favor of the LLMs. LLMs are quite obviously used for far, far, far more than trying to reproduce a New York Times article, and should not be held liable. The user who does that can be held liable because they're doing an illegal action, but not the tool maker. And so even if, in this case, the implication of what Judge Alsop was saying is that because Anthropic in their product, in the Claude product, did filters for copyrighted content, that meant they were okay. My view is actually it doesn't even matter. Like filter or no filter, and this is a big problem for like open source and just model weights and LLMs being available generally. You shouldn't have to wrap an LLM in a filter for it to be legal. Like hold users liable by all means. The tools themselves should not be held liable.
Right. I mean, that was an element of the New York Times case that rang pretty hollow to me, because we're talking about like extreme edge cases that were clearly generated for the purpose of bringing a lawsuit. And so holding OpenAI liable for that behavior seems
But there are other
unjust.
ones. Like from the llama one, like, and I linked that in there. Timothy Lee wrote about this. Like, it's actually somewhat trivial to generate a fair bit of content. But again,
I hadn't seen that. Okay, yeah, so I mean, you mentioned in your piece, I didn't read the Tim Lee portion of what you wrote in your update because it published about 15 minutes before we came on to record the podcast. But
you're excused.
But I did see that you said this bears on the future of open source models. So in what respect does it bear on open source versus some of the big model players?
Well, I mean, Judge Alsop said again and again that Anthropic's output is not violating copyright.
Right.
The reason its output is not violating copyright is because Anthropic has filters applied, which are really annoying, right? Anthropic is the one that like chides you the most or refuses to give answers the most. They're the most overbearing about that. In this case, it pays off because their product is very good about not letting you generate
copyrighted
material, reproduce copyrighted material, right? The less you have those filters, if you just train an LLM without any of the RL sort of on it, or the filters on it, or whatever the product does to stop that copyrighted material from being regenerated when the user is asking it to regenerate
Mm-hmm.
copyrighted material, it's the more likely you're going to get it, right? And so the problem is we should want, this is the trade-off bit, we should want there to be more, less restricted, less censored, just broadly available models that anyone can use to do what they want.
Right.
Implicit in that is those models could be used to generate copyrighted content. And my view is hold the user liable for that. Don't hold the tool liable. If we hold the tool liable, we're de facto restricting the market to closed products like
Because you're
Claude or like
imposing
ChatGPT.
massive administrative costs in order to
Massive
prevent
liability
that
risk.
sort
Yeah.
of liability. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense.
So
And
number three, there's one more. So there's the other thing about this is Anthropic so this is just a motion about whether the case could proceed or not.
mm-hmm.
The case can proceed on the pirated content issue, which is, and Meta is in trouble for this too. There's archives around of millions of books that have fell off a truck on the internet.
I saw that. I was not familiar with those archives, but I'm glad these model makers are availing themselves.
Oh yeah. And so so Anthropic's like, well, this is fair use, and the judge is like, well, just because your usage of it is fair use doesn't mean your acquisition is now suddenly legal of like getting all this content. And what was ruled fair use was Anthropic buying a bunch of used books, tearing off the binders, scanning them, and then throwing the physical books away and keeping the digital copies. Like that was fair use. And that's like directly downstream from the Google Books case previously. And I think that's correctly decided. And I also think it's correct that, look, Anthropic pirated a bunch of stuff and you don't get a free pass for not doing that. But this is also doesn't make sense in a way. Like Anthropic bought mostly used books, so it's not like the authors are being deprived of revenue. They went through all the hassle of scanning them in and having access to them. How, at the end of the day, the effect is no different than having just pirated them, beyond the fact that like there's a legal hurdle in
fig
here.
leaf.
Right.
Yeah.
No, exactly. And so I understand Judge Alsop's decision here. I also think if we're talking about Congress acting, this is where Congress could make a big difference. If the requirement to get books into your system is to go through, scour the earth for used books, cut the binders off, set up a scanning operation, we're cutting off startups. We're cutting off new companies. And anyone who's not willing to follow the law or is in another country and doesn't care about US IP law, like China, they have a huge advantage. And this is where I think Congress should recognize AI is really important. We as Congress, I believe there's patents in the U.S. Constitution, but by and large, copyright law is like all downstream from congressional acts.
Right.
We should tell the Library of Congress, and Congress has to do this. The Library of Congress can't do this unilaterally. Digitize all your content, make it available to U.S. AI companies to train on, which is fair use, and anyone can come and get it. And not only does that level the playing field between startups and incumbents, it actually advantages U.S. companies specifically to have more opportunities to train models. And this is I get the controversy here because it's like, is the library,
you're prioritizing AI at the expense of the works in the Library of Congress.
My point is this is happening regardless.
Yeah.
And who do we want it to be easy for? Do we want it to be easy for U.S. companies trying to follow the law, or do we want it to be easy for non-U.S. companies and bad actors? And in this case, I think the trade-off in AI is so important. I think the trade-off is worth making in this case.
Yeah, your argument makes sense to me. And earlier on, when I was talking about Congress getting involved, I don't know where Congress should fall. And honestly, you've convinced me to some degree that you have to prioritize AI.
Only took like 20 minutes. Great.
But it would be encouraging if I had a sense that Congress was paying attention to any of this. And that's where I come back to do we have the ability to pass laws and reckon with any of these questions at this point? And I think that is an open question as we move forward here, but having something codified and clear for everybody would benefit not only creators, or maybe not creators, but it would certainly benefit these companies as they sort of chart a path forward. And right now, it's like a case by case basis, and literally a case by case basis, because some of the courts elsewhere in the country may reach different answers on these questions. And so hopefully one way or another, we get some sort of black and white rules that people can anchor around as we move forward.
That's right. This is the first of many. Most of the decisions have gone broadly in favor of the AI companies. I think this is the most clear. It directly takes on the fair use question, and I think the arguments are very compelling. We can put a link to the case in the show notes. I think it's worth a read. Obviously, I just finished writing about it for Wednesday's Daily Update. But all in all, this is great news. So good note to enter the summer on.
There you go. Celebrate this fair use decision on your 4th of July.
And everyone
who's
angry about it and emailing us, sorry, we're not going to address it for at least a week and a half. So.
Yeah, exactly. We'll double back. I'm sure we'll talk more fair use as the summer